So here where I think my theories go completely off the rails, so brace yourselves. I'll start relatively tame. I think there are 3 Blackbeards. Hello my fellow wannabe Straw Hats and welcome back to the One Piece saga, where today Oda decided to shove Roger's entire story into my face without ever warning me and basically throwing everything I thought I knew upside down. So with that said, we've got so much to talk about, so let us dive right into Wano, but Act 3 this time. Anime only folks, unfortunately our shared journey must end here, as Roger's story has many things that will tie into the end of the raid, which is yet to be animated at the time of writing. So a sincere thank you for joining me thus far, but we are entering the endgame. That said, we open Act 3 with some more absolutely breathtaking visuals as we see the Fire Festival starting in full swing. Like I've mentioned throughout the series already, I think this is another one of those cases where the anime leveraged the medium to really embrace the whole atmosphere of the festival, and the tonal contrast it would set up for everything we'd see later. We'll touch on this in a second, so hold that thought for now. Meanwhile, on our Straw Hats side, we see everyone gearing up, and I was like, okay, so the raid is ready and we'll be hitting Kaido any moment now, right? But, oh no. Because we then cut to the scabbards where the magnitude of the situation really set in. Because there was no one there. Just like that, all the planning and their entire grand plan had seemingly vanished into thin air. I feel like this is actually a really big trend with Wano, more so than any other arc we've seen thus far. I think if you went through and counted the sheer number of times we see the characters just beat down time after time, I'd wager that it eclipses any other arc. Everything from Luffy's first crushing defeat against Kaido, to the betrayal that would nearly doom the mission, to the countless times Luffy and nearly every other one of our allies would get annihilated by Kaido during Roof Piece, all of it leading up to that huge reveal at the end of the arc. I know I sound like a broken record at this point, but we'll be talking plenty more about this next time, but personally, I think it's easy to forget just how much hardship we went through to ultimately defeat Kaido. Because of how ludicrously long Wano is, for me, much of it just melded into one big blob that ultimately just led up to Luffy's awakening. And on initial reading, I was a little disappointed by how seemingly quickly it happened. But now that I look back at it, and I do think this is mostly because of me binging it, much of it had already faded from my memory, but yes, we faced a lot of challenges up until now. But anyway, my point is that, once again, a huge spanner was thrown in the works as our seemingly complete raid had all but vanished. And the absolutely beautiful tragic cherry on top, the scabbards simply accept it as such and get into the boats. And as they do, we go back in time to meet Oden. And let me just preface this entire thing by saying, number one, I expected some sort of Oden flashback, but I never expected anything even remotely close to what we got. Maybe I was just silly for not picking up on the hints, but if you told me Roger and Whitebeard would feature in these, I'd call you a liar. And in a similar vein, number 2, nothing I say here will ever do this flashback justice. The sheer number of emotions I felt watching this eclipses nearly every other flashback in the series. And that's not to discount any of them. As I've said about 50 times before, every flashback in One Piece really hits different. But for reasons which are still not even entirely clear to me, this one was just out of this world. And number 3, following this point, I think this might be my worst video ever because I kind of just want to gush about things. I would love to throw in some profound analysis here and there, but something tells me I won't be able to. But anyway, with that said, let me at least try to articulate my thoughts here. First things first, we quickly learned that Kinemon, who once had luscious blonde hair, and Oden were absolute menaces to society, with Oden being essentially disowned, and Kinemon stealing a white boar, which then alerted the wrath of its parents, also literally known as the Mountain God. So yes, not exactly good. And this is one of those things that I found a ton of fun when I first watched through it. Because with what we'd heard of Oden before, I just sort of assumed that he had always been an absolute legend akin to Whitebeard. But no, despite his ridiculous power and birthright, he's not really your typical leader and is more so adventurous at heart. Ditto for Kinemon, who seriously caught me off guard as well. And no, that is not just because of his voluptuous golden hair. Up until Zo, I always thought he was a bit of a goofball, but after we learned of the true history and their ultimate goal of freeing Wano, I think he became much more serious and that wacky personality dissipated a little. But now that we're returning way back into the past, I think I once again have to give Oda huge props about just how well characterized Kinemon is. Because yes, he was a goofball, and it's only after he became a legitimate samurai that he somewhat matured, just like we've seen ever since we met him in Punk Hazard. As for Oden, after saving Kinemon and Denjiro from the mountain god, he's exiled and so they all set off to explore Wano. And it's basically here that we see the scabbards assembled, as well as the many feats of strength he'd become renowned for later on. In a scene that almost reminded me of Luffy, he saves everyone's favorite duo, Dog King Boy and Cat King Boy, as well as literally the best character in Wano, our boy Kappa. They're all no more than kids at this point, but they were going to be executed for no other reason than just being different. Obviously, this would become a huge part of Oden's story, but he was already being painted as non-discriminatory and very open-minded, which is why I liken him to Luffy, as our rubber boy too could not care less who or what you are so long as you were a friend. And we'll be talking plenty more about this later, but this too seemed like one of the many cyclical and retrospective stories we get with this one. With, again, just like Luffy and the Straw Hats, we literally see Oden's quote-unquote crew be assembled one by one, with even the cinematography resembling those early day shots of Luffy's crew all standing on the shore. And the last thing I want to mention here is how, despite his overall wackiness, Oden is actually incredibly intelligent, as under his guide they brought order to the lawless region and essentially built up Wano as we know it today. And on top of all of that, he realized that if they are to be proper representatives of Wano, they must be educated, and so he commands all of his samurai to start learning. I'd go as far as to say that, in terms of character development, Oden very quickly shot up to be one of my favorites so far, as we literally see his entire journey from being a young brassy kid who just can't help but get into trouble, to a much wiser leader who understands that even these small formalities are absolutely crucial if he is to become shogun. I think that one scene of everyone expecting them to arrive as ruffians, but them actually arriving all super traditional and proper, just spoke to how much Oden had already grown. And that's not even mentioning his life-changing journey alongside Roger, that no doubt influenced his ultimate decision to open up the borders of Wano. Something we'd soon learn is actually a far bigger deal than what it may look like. Oh yeah, and one thing I forgot to mention is that we also meet Orochi here, but literally no one likes Orochi, so no one cares. Like, literally, my only notes on him here at this point was, Orochi is a mega bootlicker. That is literally it. Soon thereafter, after the Rocks pirates had dissolved and created their own crews, Whitebeard along with his crew landed on Wano. And it's here where my eyeballs widened about 50 times. Because everything following this point is something that I just don't think I will ever be able to put into words. I'm guessing most of you know the exact feeling I'm talking about, but I literally expected none of this. Moments after Whitebeard lands, we already see him and Oden trade blows, and man, this shot here literally gave me chills. Everything from the animation to the sound design to how this encounter happens in the first place, for lack of a better expression, I was floored. Though also right away, we see even more characterization of Whitebeard, as it's clear to everyone on his crew that he actually really liked Oden. And it's just that he believes Oden's not the type to sail under someone, referencing his experience with the Rocks pirates. I think this is just one of countless scenes we've already seen with Whitebeard that further cement him as one of the most observant pirates out there, as he's basically been able to profile basically everyone he's met to a T. Even thinking back to him meeting Luffy, with a mere handful of words and swirling his spear around, he was immediately able to tell that, yes, he is someone worth following. Ditto for Ace, where he understood that he's going to get himself killed and that his skills could be used for better things. And here too, sure, Oden would end up sailing with Whitebeard, but he was completely right about him, right? Every time they talk about planning and whatnot, Oden would already be halfway across the island. And conversely, I think this also brings Oden's story full circle, because deep down, he is still that adventurous menace that we saw way back when. Only now, he's gotten wiser and instead of causing trouble, just wants to learn what more is out there. And speaking of which, the whole challenge he must undergo to join Whitebeard is just pure excellence. Number 1, I love how ridiculously over the top Oda makes these things. Just like we've seen before with Ace fighting Jinbei for 5 days and whatnot, Oden has to hold onto the chain for 3 days. Which is, well, not exactly easy. Oh, and side note, now that we know how the arc ends, I find the shot of Oden flying with Whitebeard's ship very sus. Almost as if we too would return to Wano. Huh. Oh, I don't know, like we would complete our journey just like Roger, and then return to Wano to get reinforcements for the final war. And finally, starting another golden age of pirates, huh? But with him dangling on the chain for literal days, he easily becomes admired by the crew and is essentially already accepted into the Whitebeard pirates. That is, until he hears a woman's voice screaming for help. And just like that, despite looking like something out of SpongeBob, Oden immediately lets go of the chain and goes to save her. I honestly think there's an entire video's worth of discussion about Oden and about how his personality is always this clash between a almost childlike desire for adventure, but also honor and wanting to protect those who cannot protect themselves. So I don't want to get too caught up in the debate here, but yet again, Oda managed to get me so invested into Oden's journey in the space of like 4 episodes that I was just glued to my screen at this point. But in story, we learn that the woman screaming for help is named Toki and that she comes from the Void Century. Now, like I said last time, I do think that her fruit brings up a frankly unhealthy number of questions like, when is it even reborn? I would assume after her death in the present day, right? Like, it doesn't travel back in time to where she would have died naturally, right? Also, can we even be sure that she is dead? Couldn't she have traveled forward in time once again after delivering the prophecy seconds before death? Also, because she is literally from the Void Century, could it be that Roger's journey isn't even the reason he found out the secrets of the Void Century? What if it's literally Toki just telling them about it? They spent a long time together, right? Surely they would have talked about how life was back in her time. I mean, yeah, they seemingly didn't believe her at first, but they still spent years together, right? Also, let's talk about fighting capability. Couldn't Toki single-handedly defeat Kaido by sending him millions of years into the future and be done with it? Yes, before you ask, she does 100% have stronger Haki than Kaido, don't at me. Anyway, my insane overthinking aside, while I do think that Toki's existence is almost too convenient compared to what I expect from Oda, I am at least glad that it doesn't create some ridiculous plot holes with traveling back in time, and generally speaking, I do think it was still an interesting concept to explore. In the meantime though, everyone's least favorite purple hair clown alongside with his lovely grandma overthrow the entirety Wano leadership and Orochi becomes shogun. But like I said before, no one likes or cares about Orochi, so let's not talk about that. Oh, and as if I didn't hate Orochi enough, the fact that the Clone Clone fruit appears here just reminded me of the ever-loyal legend Bon Clay. So I'm now both sad and mad, and let's just not talk about him ever again, okay? Back on Whitebeard's ship, Oden's journey continues until they spot a particular island where we see a particular gentleman. Enter Goldie Roger.
We're still going. Okay.
I know I've said this a million times already, but every single second of this just blew me away. And like I said in my Patreon reactions, I am so glad we had to wait up until Wano to learn of this, because something here was just magical. How do you put into words 900 plus episodes worth of anticipation, all being blasted out of the water in the space of a single flashback? I would love to give some constructive criticism and story analysis here, but let me be honest with you. At this point, I was just a starstruck fan seeing stories we'd heard legends of finally come to life in the most beautifully directed and animated way possible. And also in terms of waiting, I am so glad we had to wait for Wano's animation to see this. In any other scenario, I'd say the animation here was way over the top, but not here. As far as I'm concerned, I was watching literal mythic beings clash in front of my very eyes. And in my mind, they were 100% being done justice. They should be exaggerated. These are literally legends clashing. Oh, and let me make one thing clear. This isn't me overreacting because I haven't slept on it. This portion you're listening to right now, unlike a lot of what you've been hearing so far, is literally recorded 4 months after I watched the episode. I've more than slept on this, and I still can't help but gush about every single detail here. But alright, I will chill out for just a moment and list off some of my favorite bits in this first meeting. Number 1, the fact that Oden is literally just sent flying through tree after tree after tree is probably both the funniest, as well as the most epic introduction to Roger you could probably ever have. Number 2, like I said, the animation here was nothing short of excellent, with so many different styles being mixed in here. We see those reductions to basic shapes a la Mob Psycho, we see flashing to black and white, we saw full-on hockey clashing, we saw their close-up faces being distorted by the complete carnage. It was just excellent. Number 3, the fact that during this whole thing they're both just laughing is literally peak One Piece, and if we don't get a scene like this with Luffy and Shanks at some point, I will cry tears saltier than the Grand Line itself. Number 4, perhaps the absolute best parts, us later learning that their crews fought for days, but then it turned into a gift exchange almost killed me, and come on, someone give Oda an award already because these characters are just too good. And lastly, number 5, and I know this will make you happy, after seeing Shanks and Buggy in this flashback, I will happily accept my 50th Big L card because I love these two and we need to see them reunite in the present day, like literally right now. But all of that aside, it is here where lore drop after lore drop begins. Roger explains that 13 years ago they set foot on Lodestar, the final island of the Grand Line which no one had set their foot on. But as quickly as they landed, they realized that this is not the final island after all, essentially repeating what we learned back on Zou about how the true final island lies beyond the Grand Line. And exactly like Luffy, he says that if they reach it, they'll become the greatest pirates, and very conveniently, we are cut off before he continues his speech, very clearly evoking Luffy, Sabo, and Ace, who too were cut off as Luffy made his proclamation. We'll be talking plenty more about this when we get to the post-Wano manga story, but I think their shared dream is to make everyone a pirate. I talked a bit more about it when the chapter originally came out, and I think it makes sense knowing what we know now. And you know, there is this one more detail that I know you're going to laugh at me, but just hear me out, okay? The chapter literally released on Talk Like a Pirate Day. Like, come on, this can't be more perfect. My reaction to the chapter is in the card, and I do talk about it a bit more there, but yeah, more on that later. In terms of this scene though, like I mentioned with the original meeting, everything here just hit me in the feels so hard. Everything from the old school One Piece music kicking in to Roger's proclamation, everything seemed eerily familiar as it was clearly evoking Luffy and his brothers, to the point that even their bandages match, but also entirely foreign and exciting at the same time. It walked a really bizarre line between feeling nostalgic, but also maintaining that go pace of the flashback thus far. And you also have to remember that my nostalgia for One Piece is like literally a year at most. So that should say a lot about how masterfully these scenes are crafted. There really is no nostalgia here for me, but it still felt so nostalgic. Though, in the midst of all of this, we also hear that Blackbeard apparently never sleeps. Now, initially, I was sort of questioning whether this is even true. As in, could this just be an in-joke or something like that is just caught on and they keep saying he doesn't sleep? But based on what they say here, I am sort of leaning toward this being fact after all. So, effectively, he has lived a third longer than any person of the same age around him, and I find that very spooky. And it's also here where I think my theories go completely off the rails, so brace yourselves. I'll start relatively tame. I think there are 3 Blackbeards. Well, not exactly 3 Blackbeards, but I think he has 3 different people with 3 different souls inside of him. I've already talked about how I think his whole 3 skull flag symbolizes him getting a third power. So this is largely an extension to that, which also ropes in my multiple fruit acquisition theory, which I've mentioned before. I won't lie, I dove into some pretty weird rabbit holes looking into this stuff, so I won't bore you with all the details, but I'll say that I don't think it's a coincidence that his right hand is always the one that uses black hole power. If you look at the Blackbeard flag in the real world, which many do consider to actually not be true, but it is still widely adopted as representative, so just bear with me here, the right hand is toasting the devil, while the left stabs a heart. Both figuratively through his betrayal and very literally as Whitebeard's chest had a gaping hole, Blackbeard stabbed him in the heart, while toasting the devil and stealing his power with his right hand. But okay, what does that have to do with him not sleeping or there being 3 Blackbeards? Well, for one, Blackbeard is extremely inconsistent to the point that he spits in Whitebeard's face and the very next second he is begging for his life. There's being scared and then there is this, right? So in my mind, these are 2 different personalities. One which orchestrated this whole thing and is the brains in the operation, while the other is the actual fighter. And so, what about the third? Well, entertain this idea for me. The third is still dormant and is waiting for a fruit that will allow him to split. Basically, the TLDR for me here is that with Blackbeard being multiple people, he gains both the advantage of having around-the-clock time for thinking, as well as the added benefit of harboring multiple fruits. That said, I think with the amount of time he's had to think, he came to the conclusion that if he were to travel with someone from Rox's crew, he could potentially find a fruit that would allow him to split back into 3 people. Whitebeard just happened to be the first one he came across and managed to travel with, which is when he set his eyes on the darkness fruit, which he knew could be leveraged to steal powers because of its unique properties of absorbing all light. And with that in his pocket, he used the second power slot to obtain a devastatingly powerful ability, which then makes the rest of his plan essentially foolproof. He has a massively OP ability. He has the power to steal whichever power he wants, and now all he has to do is just find the final one which will allow him to split into 3 people. Okay, yeah, I admit most of it makes absolutely no sense, but trust me, I had a theory about him toasting Davy Jones because he traded his souls for power or something like that, so let's just move on. And now with Oden sailing alongside Roger, we get a series of scenes that honestly hit me in the feels harder than most character deaths, because oh boy, hearing the entire crew singing Binks' Sake was so awesome, but also weirdly sad at the same time. I don't know if it's just me being weirdly sentimental again, but seriously, something about it just seemed super depressing. But then we see all the locations we've traveled as Roger makes his second journey around. And this was just so beautiful. And yes, I will not lie, arriving at Skypiea really hit a funny bone for me.
He did the thing!
And we also see how Rogers' message got there. It was Oden who inscribed it. Which again just brings us full circle to when we saw it for the first time and heard Rogers' voice. And then seeing them fall down with the octopus exactly like Luffy and the crew landing in Water 7, oh my poor little heart, why? And meeting Iceberg and Tom again, oh it was just so good. And the fact that Frankie straight up met Oden and Roger like a couple of months before they finished their journey, by the time we're done here, Frankie will have casually met 2 Pirate Kings. That is no small feat. But one thing that I found really interesting is what we see when they arrive on Fishman Island. As after seeing Katakuri's power, I assumed that Madame Charlie just had insane observation hockey which allowed her to peer far into the future. But now, with characters like Toki and even our creatively named Prophet Dude, it once again brings up the tangible side of fate in the world of One Piece, which I really hope we delve into at some point in the future, even if it is merely mentioned as a factor as it is in JoJo for example. Because like yeah, with everything going on, I mean at this point, yes, fate is 1,000,000% a tangible force affecting the world of One Piece, right? I mean, even Oden meeting Roger in the first place. You must remember that there are not a lot of people who can read the Poneglyphs, and they still met and everything happened as it did. Though another thing to note here is that we see one of the red Poneglyphs used to be here, which also brings up the question, why the f did Neptune not mention it to Luffy? And perhaps even more importantly, when did it disappear? Up until Marineford, Fishman Island was Whitebeard's territory, so was he the one who moved it somewhere safe? I think Elbaf is a safe bet at this point, but that is of course assuming that it even was them who took it. As far as I know, this hasn't been confirmed, but technically after Whitebeard's death, Big Mom started to work on Fishman Island, so could the road Poneglyph we found there actually be the Fishman Island one? I think there's also the chance that Blackbeard took it during the Grudge War, so it could be on his little pirate skull island, I suppose? Well, guess I will find out in about 900 episodes, am I right? Though, following their brief stop at Zoe and seeing the Pedro flashback again, we see Roger's health quickly degrading as they neared their final venture. And at the same time, Buggy too falls incredibly sick and Shanks decides to stay behind to make sure his loyal brother-in-arms doesn't die. Now, I'll be honest, I don't know how much of this is just making sure that Shanks and Buggy, both of whom are clearly major powers in the world today, never completed their journey, and how much of it I should look into further. Honestly, at this point, I wouldn't even be surprised if the reason why Buggy is so incredibly lucky today is exactly because he got so unlucky back then. In my mind, that very much seems like a Oda thing to do. I know there are some theories about how Devil Fruit users get sick when approaching the final island, but I kinda don't buy it. I sort of feel like it just takes away from the tragedy that is Roger's story in the first place. As in, he literally just falls sick. Just like Whitebeard, who too was succumbing to age. Both were legendary men, but ultimately, it was just a sickness that got them. And even then, both of them went out on their own terms. I feel like that shaping your own destiny aspect would just be lost if it is indeed, oh, when we approach the final island, we get sick. I feel like if he were to be hiding the Gomu Gomu fruit or something like that all along, in my mind, that just cheapens Roger's story, and I'm really not a fan, but I guess only time will tell. Oh, and also, there were quite a few shots in this one where we literally saw both Shanks and Buggy watch as they literally pinned down their final stop. So, do they both already know its location? Is that another hint toward the island not actually being static, but moving in some manner? Who knows? But with that, we reach it. You might have noticed that I deliberately haven't said those words yet, because once again, it is a funny story, and it is in fact not Raftel, it is Laugh-Tale. I've sat here on this part of the script for over an hour now, but I just can't seem to find the words. I think all of you who have read the story yourself will be able to relate to this feeling, but it's one that I just cannot really explain. It's just a mesmerizing moment where everything is solved. It's something so far beyond our understanding that you're just left laughing, just like Roger. But underneath all of that, there is this sense of impending doom, because what now? Where do we go from here? This is both the figurative as well as literal end of the road for Roger's journey, so what now? I think the closest way of describing the emotions here is like when you finish a show and you just have that feeling of emptiness for a moment. It's just such a beautifully written scene. And like, what comes next? Shanks asked Roger something after he returned, but then burst into tears. Now, initially, I thought this just has to be one of Oda's hints again, right? Like maybe Shanks was asking about the Liberator that would be Joy Boy, but Roger said that no, it's too early. But then I thought that no, Roger is dying. And based on what we've seen, he is essentially a father figure for Shanks, so I don't think there's anything more to it. This is just a boy seeing his father succumbing to an illness. For me, the death of Roger so far had always been this event that started it all, but here we flip it and it is the end. And something about that just struck a chord with me so much. And the scene of Roger's execution, which we have literally seen hundreds of times already. Why did it hit so different this time? I hate this so much, but I love it so much. Alright, I'll try to stop with my weird sentimentality again, but the last thing I want to talk about here is Roger being quote-unquote too early. Now, let me set out my current line of thinking. I think the Rio Poneglyph, or in other words, the combined message of all the Poneglyphs, is simply a collection of stories about a mythical warrior of liberation, that being Joy Boy. It might not even be set in stone. Get it? Set in stone because it's like literally inscribed in a stone? Sorry, I couldn't resist it. But yeah, it might not even be an idea that is set in stone and is more so a concept that details a warrior of light who, just like in most legends, would rise above darkness. To sprinkle in some of our own Latvian culture, one of our most popular epic poems, titled The Bear Slayer, literally details this mythical hero's battle against the Black Knight. The very idea of fighting against this sort of villain of darkness is just hardwired into us humans and shows up in basically every other culture as well. which is exactly what I think we're looking at today with Luffy and his Gear 5, where despite his rubber abilities and attacks which have nothing to do with it, his appearance is completely white. He is the Warrior of Light first and foremost. And surprise surprise, on the complete opposite side we have Blackbeard, literally being the Warrior of Darkness. And also, then there's the question of why was Roger too early? Now, we talked about some of this during my chapter reading streams after I got caught up, but now I'm beginning to lean toward the idea that we've actually been overthinking it. Because the reason why Roger was too early is literally told to us by Madame Charlie. Joy Boy will return in 20 years, and that is it. It's not that Roger saw something on Laugh Tale that wasn't ready yet. I think it's literally just the fact that Roger knew that someone like Joy Boy would be just as driven to find the final island. Roger knew that he'd be a worthy rival and, more importantly, a friend. And so, he just laughed, knowing that one day the Warrior of Liberation will return. I do think that in the midst of all of this, there's also a conversation to be had around the pickiness of the voice of all things and why Luffy seemed to have only acquired it later on, and whether some of these are in fact retcons, but whatever the case, let me just wrap this whole thing up by saying this is my favorite flashback and I don't think it's getting topped ever again. As much as it pains me to say this, I think in broad strokes, this is the last we've seen of Roger. And the only real time I can picture him appearing again is when we reach Laugh Tale ourselves. And this whole nostalgic look back has me thinking of a particular chef. I can't quite pin it down why, but I really want to mention some sort of chef. Though, after news spreads that Roger did in fact conquer the sea, Oden makes his way back to Wano, where he learns everything that has happened since, with Orochi and Kaido and everything in between. And with that, the Scabbards unite once again to take the fight to Kaido. Only, as they arrived to the battlefield, they were already met with heavy resistance, revealing that someone had already tipped Kaido off. Which is again another case of this arc being very cyclical, because history is literally repeating itself in the present, so we'll get to that in a second. And perhaps the worst part, no one ever learned of what truly happened. Everyone hated Oden. They never knew that his little silly dances saved 100 people each. And once again, I feel like with the bigger story of Oden we've seen, this just hits so much harder. Because tragically, he is almost back to square one. A laughingstock hated by everyone. While in reality, his unwavering honor is the thing that is keeping these people alive. And it's then when we get what is hands down the most brutal scene in this flashback. Oden being boiled in oil, as he literally holds up his allies and, by extension, the fate of the entirety of Wano on his very shoulders. Call me an old man for not liking memes, but this is one of those moments that I kind of wish wasn't memed by the community because it is just absolutely brutal. I use this example all the time, but like, you know that gif of Walter White falling down? I will never be able to watch Breaking Bad again because of that scene. I literally just laugh when I see that scene, and I shouldn't be laughing at that scene. And in a broader sense, the fact that Kaido accepts Oden's bet in the first place, I think speaks to how indifferent toward life he really is. Just like we'd see in his battle against Luffy, much of this is no more than a game to him. And that is also exactly what we see with Momo, because Kaido could have easily killed him, but he doesn't. In his mind, he has already won, so he just walks off. And it's exactly that pride that will get him, I think, killed? But more on that in the raid. And I memed about no one caring about him before, but I also like that Orochi was just a straight up coward through and through. I feel like a lot of the baddies so far are just these big bad fighters, whereas Orochi was just this weak, conniving. Yeah, I've got no other way of putting it. Everybody hates Orochi, so it is what it is. But as we return to the present, we get even more absolutely incredible scenes and lines as we hear them say, "We are already abandoned by heaven." But as they say that, they still get in the flimsy small boats and set off. At this point, they have nothing to lose, right? Even if it is certain death. There's nothing more they can do, and so they just keep going. And it's then that they finally piece it together. The common thread that had been dangling in everyone's minds. This is just like what happened 20 years ago, back when they faced defeat while still fighting alongside Oden. There is a traitor. And holy you know how much I've been talking about betrayals and sussy law and whatnot, right? This was perfect. The fact that Kanjuro, one of the seemingly wackiest and most wholesome characters ever, backstabbed everyone here and I never saw it coming? What? And the scene as a whole is just perfect. The sheer dread that sets in as they realize the magnitude of the situation and the storm is just pouring down. Oh, it was so good. But fortunately, all is not quite lost. Because somewhere in the distance, a certain someone is laughing his way over here. And that is where we'll pick up next time. Again, no tier list just yet, but to summarize my thoughts on this portion of the arc, do I even need to say anything? Frankly, I know this is a bad video because I probably missed like a million details. I didn't really say anything profound, but I just can't help but smile while talking about the Roger flashback and everything it entailed. I know I've done the YouTuber thing of using X is peak One Piece, but this is really peak One Piece in my opinion. And I hope if you're still around, I hope you'll forgive my overindulgence in just sheer gushing. I seriously cannot help it. But yes, with that, next time we'll pick back up with our captain because it is time to lead the raid on Onigashima. And unlike with this flashback, there I do have a lot of thoughts and maybe my horrible takes will return once more. So I hope to see you back as we finally delve into the climax of Wano. And that's the video. Sorry for the big delay, but you have no idea how much trouble I had with this edit. The whole thing got corrupted and then I had to redo parts of it. It was an absolute nightmare. But whatever the case, the dread is truly setting in as the next video should wrap up the now more than a year-long One Piece saga, and I kind of want to stall for time. But with that, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my ramblings, so seriously, thank you, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.